Hi, my name is Amanda Marks. I'm a graduate student at Morningside College and an 8th grade special education teacher at Thomas Jefferson Middle School in Dubuque, Iowa. My research is the effect of vocabulary instruction and the correlation of scores on standardized assessments. The problem here was there was no real vocabulary instruction when it came to any classroom, general education or special education. Students were simply looking up words in the dictionary and were expected to remember those definitions. Of course, there was no retention of the vocabulary words and students were not engaged. Because students were not learning vocabulary like they should, reading scores were decreasing. As we know, vocabulary is an important part of reading. It affects students' fluency, comprehension, and overall reading achievement. Why I chose this topic? I've been teaching fusion reading for 5 years now. Fusion reading has a direct vocabulary instruction aspect in the curriculum, and I was seeing my students' test scores were increasing quite significantly. If not at grade level, most of them were scoring well above their peers in the area of vocabulary. So I wanted to look at direct vocabulary instruction over indirect vocabulary instruction that some of the students in the general education classroom were getting. The importance of this, that direct vocabulary instruction is important in any content area. Students learn different meanings to words when taught affixes, so prefix, root, and suffix. They were able to understand the meaning of those, and then in turn be able to figure out meanings of other words on their own independently without teacher guidance. And it was also increasing their reading comprehension along with their vocabulary knowledge, as the two are really tied together. For my literature review, I looked at three studies that I wanted to focus on for this presentation. First one, Nami and Fu in 2015 compared indirect vocabulary instruction to a group of students taught with direct vocabulary instruction. The way they did this was half of the students were in a direct vocabulary instruction group, the other half in indirect. The direct vocabulary piece was the use of flashcards with a group. They used them throughout the instruction of all the words and then used them as they would come up within the unit in the classroom, and then again to practice before the assessment. Obviously, the direct vocabulary instruction group scored higher on their assessment over the indirect vocabulary instruction group. Another study that I want to looked at was Kelly, Alexis, Kiefer, and Baller in 2010. What they used was vocabulary words in a content area and how students learn those words. So they looked at a textbook and they picked out 8 or 9 words that the students would use throughout that unit, and they focused on those in their vocabulary instruction. At the beginning of the unit, the students were taught the definition of those words and looked them up in the dictionary, and they practiced them a couple of the first weeks there. And then around the mid-unit, they focused a little bit on the affixes and the morphology of those words, and then kind of looked at using them in their own sentences. The students that were taught the direct vocabulary instruction did increase on their assessments. The last one, Fisher, Frey, and Lapp, 2012, is a study where students looked up words in the dictionary. They did not build any background knowledge, and students were just shown how to look up the words. As the weeks went on, the educators modeled their thinking aloud when it came to vocabulary and looking up the parts and their meanings, but students were not taught the meanings of the prefix, root, and suffix. They were, however, able to look and recognize the patterns in the families as the time went on. Those students also did fairly better on their assessments. Past research on vocabulary instruction says that direct vocabulary instruction over indirect vocabulary instruction was better, but they didn't give specifics for direct vocabulary instruction. For instance, there was no research on the use of prefix, root, and suffix to teach those meanings and the morphology to the words, and there was no research on fusion vocabulary. The objectives of my research: what are the effects of teaching direct vocabulary instruction over indirect vocabulary instruction to students in middle school over a 2-year period? The purpose of this study was to determine the effectiveness in fusion reading vocabulary throughout the Iowa testing program's vocabulary percentiles. The impacts on the fields. This research only further validates the previous research already proven. However, I feel that this adds a little bit more with dealing with middle school age participants and adds the fusion reading curriculum aspect as well. The impacts on educators. It incorporates independent skills that the students can use to figure out the definition of words independently. So by teaching them the prefix, root, and suffix, they are able to look up their definitions or understand the definition of new words independently without the use of a teacher or an aide. My research design was a quasi-experimental design to measure the growth over 2 years of direct vocabulary instruction over the indirect vocabulary instruction. My participants. The age of the participants ranged from 13 to 14 years old. My control group, I had 8 8th grade participants. 3 were female, 5 were male. They were all Caucasian except 1 male was African American. In my experimental group, I had 8 8th grade participants. 2 were female, 6 were male. All of those participants were Caucasian. My experimental variables. My independent variable is the direct vocabulary instruction using the fusion curriculum. My dependent variable were the test scores on the standardized assessment, the Iowa testing program. Reliability and validity. The students all received the same curriculum and standardized assessment. The only difference was the teaching method of the teacher when implementing the fusion reading. Materials needed for this. The researcher needed the ITP instructor manual with the directions and the time limits for the testing. The fusion reading curriculum that taught the students the direct vocabulary instruction. Participants needed the Iowa testing materials, so their booklet and answer sheet, a pencil, and then for the fusion piece, they needed their fusion binder for the vocabulary instruction with their prefix, root, and suffix card and their sheet to fill out the vocabulary. The procedure. The control group received vocabulary instruction determined by their general education teacher. 2 experimental group received direct vocabulary instruction using the fusion curriculum. 3 both groups received the same set of vocabulary words for the Iowa testing program assessment, as they are all 8th grade students and all take the same test. The data analysis plan used the ANOVA repeated measures to analyze the data. The main effects of data used in ANOVA repeated measures were the groups of students, the performance across the 2 groups, and then the separate groups and their growth. So I measured the three sections: the groups, separate groups performance, the performance across the 2 groups, and then their groups from the 2 years that the study was performed over. The mean scores from both groups were compared using the ANOVA repeated measures. My results. The data did not support the hypothesis that having direct vocabulary instruction over indirect vocabulary instruction would increase the student's score on a standardized assessment. This is my results. My control group, an experimental group with standard deviation. My F ratio. The main effect analysis comparing the pre-test and post-test scores found regardless of what group, student scores did improve. However, the control group did score higher. Here's a chart, or excuse me, the table to help show that a little bit better. My experimental group, pre-test, control group, pre-test, post-test. As you can see, the control group did increase. However, the experimental group did higher, scored higher. However, percentage-wise, my control group did start higher and higher than my experimental. Here's another way to look at it on this figure. This is the Iowa testing program percentiles here on the left. My control group and then my experimental group. Pre-test is blue, post-test is orange. Once again, showing that standard deviation of my control group starting higher, ending higher, and then the experimental group, the growth that they had. For my discussion section, I'm going to explain the implications, limitations, and recommendations for further research. Some implications from this: participants in this study were exposed to direct vocabulary instruction that improved their vocabulary results over the 2-year period. They received the knowledge of morphologically breaking apart words to understand the roots and affixes that's going to better support their learning of meanings of unknown words in the future. They were also able to see their growth in the area of vocabulary from year to year on the Iowa testing program. Our students received those results back at conferences in the spring and are able to see their growth from year to year. Some other implications: it actually increases their fluency and accuracy while reading, and they're able to use some of the skills taught in the Fusion reading to break down those words and understand new words while they're reading, not just only in Fusion, but in other classes that they have. Some of my limitations were the number of participants in the study. I did start out higher, however, a lot of my students moved out to the co-taught setting instead of the Fusion reading, so I had to decrease my number of participants. The length of study over 2 years was a little long. I chose the participants, and then the setting and demographics for the participants, they all come from a low-income school, all Caucasian except for the one student. Recommendations for future: I would like larger participant groups, shorter time period to conduct the study, maybe 1 year instead of 2. And then another assessment tool to look at the growth instead of just the Iowa testing program. Another standardized assessment could be helpful. And then I would also like to add a second control group that received a different reading support curriculum instead of Fusion or the Gen Ed, maybe something in between there. Some of our second chance readers or Title I to see the growth in their scores as well. Here's some of my references that I used. And that's it. Thank you for watching.